Hi, everyone, and welcome to the April 4th, 2020 version of the Velero community meeting / open discussion. So today we get a bunch of status updates per usual. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat or just unmute yourself. And if you have any discussion topics, we do have a few already today, so we'll try to get through those as soon as possible. I'll be sharing my screen so you can all see the agenda for today as well. And do that. There we go. And yeah, let's start with Carlisia today.
Okay. So yes, oh sure. I forgot to collect the PRs from Helm. I'll add them next week because I think some of them are, we have a cluster of some that are fixing things, and I'll add them next week. But in any case, we had some activity that I was reviewing and testing on the Helm repo. I took that CLI design proposal for configure to change the installation and break it down to separate commands, and I added different issues for each of the things. If anyone thinks that there's something missing, please let me know. Yeah, I turned it into an epic.
This looks great.
Yeah, it's coming. And next. Oh yeah, that's the first thing that I'm going to tackle, which is to change the behavior of Velero to not halt the server if there is any. So right now, if there is even one invalid backup storage location, Velero will not like it and not work. So we're going to change that. So Velero continues work and continues checking. And if you don't have any valid backup location, the worst that's going to happen is you can create backup, but Velero will continue working and continue checking. So as soon as you have one that is valid, it will let you make backups. And the advantage of that too is that right now, if you have two backup locations and one is invalid, Velero will not even let you use the other one because it just will stop working. So after this change, even if you have any invalid backup locations, you can still use any one that's valid. And part of that is I added a topic for discussion in the other section, because we might be able to use some the work that Nolan added. He has a PR to add a liveness check or healthiness check or liveness check to Velero, and that might be useful for this. But we can, yeah, let me just finish my status. Oh, and I'm doing a presentation for Velero today at this meetup in Brazil. Originally, it was going to be Kubernetes Community Day, which is the equivalent of KubeCon in different regions of the world, because the CNCF is not going to have KubeCons all over. So because of the virus, they turned it into an online meetup. And that's it. And the other presenter is also someone involved with Velero, Carlos Patanato. So that's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Were you supposed to be there in person for this?
They did invite me, but it was just one day, and it was not worthwhile going. I mean, it was just very, of all the things that we could travel for, that one was a bit challenging to travel that far for a one-day event.
Totally get that. So you'll be presenting this at 12 p.m.
Pacific time,
right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it'll be in Portuguese. So.
Will this be recorded? Do you know?
Yeah, sure. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure.
Excellent. If it is, we'll add it to the playlist later.
Okay.
This is great.
Yeah, it's going to be mostly demo more than presenting.
This is perfect. Yeah, this is going to be super fun. I'll definitely watch it, even if I will barely understand anything.
Can I crash, Carlisia?
Sorry?
This is Rafael. Can I crash?
Of course, yes. You can help me too.
Awesome. Yeah, this is going to be, I hope you have a blast during this, Carlisia. Looks like it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
So the weird thing is that I've actually tried to do a technical talk in Greek one time. It was the trippiest thing ever because all the terms and all the things you know are in English, but then you're trying to explain them in a different language. It was trippy. I mean,
Yeah.
It took me twice as long to prepare because I had to figure out what I was gonna say in certain situations. So I appreciate how hard it is. So good job, Carlisia.
Well,
Ahead of time, we know
you
you're
are
going to do a great
assuming
job.
I'm going to do a good job with the translation. Well, I will try.
Yeah.
It's painful for sure. Doesn't mean it's going to be successful, but I will do my best.
I'm being for English.
Yeah, if you get bored with them, just switch to a different language and see if you can mess them up a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you so much for stepping up and doing this, Carlisia.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to first. Any questions, comments, concerns for Carlisia? All right, then we'll move over to Steve.
Yeah, hey everyone. So I'm on community support this week. That'll definitely take up some of my time. Over the past week, done lots of PR reviews. There's lots going on as far as the CSI work, the work Carlisia is doing on the install and config experience, and various other things. So this definitely kept me busy. I did find some time last week to do some hands-on testing on the CSI snapshot plugins that are under development, and things are starting to look pretty good. They're starting to sort of stabilize. I did find a couple of bugs that I logged into the repo, so potentially we'll find some time this week to try and help out with some fixes there, and still plenty more testing to do as well. So if I find time, I will continue working on that. I spent some time doing some cleanup on our plugin example repo, which was sort of in need of some maintenance. So I did a little bit of reorganization of the code, as well as some cleanup on the make file and the CI, including migrating to GitHub Actions for CI. So I think this repo is in a pretty good state now, and some of the changes that I made there, I'd like to sort of propagate to the other plugin repos that we maintain. Some of them already have some of the changes, so just be a matter of kind of going through and figuring out what changes should be made to each of them. But hopefully this repo is now a little bit cleaner and is a better jumping off point for anyone who wants to implement their own plugins. And then beyond that, I talked a little bit about some research into how we could report backup progress last week, and I spent a little bit more time on that. Still sort of figuring out exactly what this might look like. So hopefully I'll have something to share or demo in the coming weeks, but I'm planning to spend some more time on that this week.
That's actually a super exciting area, Steve, so we look forward to that. So I think that's gonna make a significant impact to the folks that are using Velero.
Yeah, this is great. For the plugin example repo, do you want to put any of this into the Velero docs? I know we have some of it over there, but do you want to integrate it there at all? It's fine to keep it here. I was just wondering.
I mean, we already have some docs that point to this, and I didn't make any significant changes to the README. There's not really new content here. you know, I can take a look and see if there's more stuff that should be copied, but I didn't really make changes to the documentation.
I think it was mostly getting like Go mod, getting stuff moved over to Go mod and getting the versions updated, wasn't it?
Go mod, I restructured the packages to move things into an internal package, moved to GitHub Actions, did a bunch of cleanup on the make file and the Docker file. So mostly internal stuff.
I have an. Are you done, Jonas?
Yeah.
I have another question about this that I had seen it in the GitHub settings, and I'm wondering if it's. I don't want to take up a ton of time with it. I'm just going to plant the seed and we can talk about it later. There's a template repo thing on GitHub that I wonder if we could use this for and mark this as a template repo for folks that want to make plugins. So that may be something we could investigate. But I don't want to take up a ton of time with that today. I'm just gonna mention that maybe we could make this a template repo. But I don't know what that entails. Like, I don't know what effect that would have on the repo itself. So,
is anybody using that repo today?
Well, effectively what we ask people to do is check it out and then use it as a template and delete code and write their own stuff in it. So, but I don't know what the GitHub, like, I don't know how the template workflow works within GitHub. So it may be that like you click fork and then it does a bunch of templating, but I would have to look into how that works.
Got it. A topic for a future.
Yeah, we can put that on for some investigation. And also I'm seeing that this says Arc and not Velero. So that can all be changed. But I was just wondering if anybody else had seen that. But that can be a thing for later.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with it, but no, we can definitely take a look.
Okay.
Cool. Any other questions, comments for Steve? All right, Nolan.
Of course, I muted myself and lost the button. So I got the CSI structures getting uploaded. That should be ready and done, ready for review now. The only issue I'm aware of is that it is not uploading volume snapshot contents, and that's because the plugin is not labeling them right now, which is a pretty small fix that we just need to make in the plugin. So that's ready for review, and with the comments on screen, I think I've addressed the last of the issues that Steve had raised. Cleaned up some duplication of some of those functions. There are some to-dos kind of sprinkled throughout the code, but I don't think any of them are crucial to getting the core functionality of this PR done. So that's finished. Since I got that kind of wrapped up and am waiting, I moved on to looking at some of the CRD issues that have been reported. These two were filed by the same person and they kind of split them up. So I've got a couple reproduction cases that I just got in last night. So I need to take those and actually reproduce them now. And while I was waiting for that, I started as part of our 1.4 backlog, I started taking a look at this this restoring a namespace resource issue. This bug came up basically because this user wanted to specifically restore only the namespace, where Velero currently just skips a namespace and assumes nobody wants to restore a namespace by itself. They always want to restore namespaced resources. So I'm investigating how we might be able to make this more useful. And in the
But
course,
if you don't mind me asking, Nolan, why does he only want to restore a namespace without resources?
that I don't know. Steve had talked to him some, and
They're doing a kind of a two-stage restore here. So first they restore a namespace, and then maybe do some other processing, and then restore additional resources into it. But I don't know more details beyond that.
So it might be create the namespace, go add some processes, lock it down, or anything else, and then go restore the objects.
yeah,
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah.
In that case, it might make more sense than okay.
Yeah, and I think what I wanted to see was can we accommodate both cases, both do our lazy restore that we're doing now, and treat the namespace like we would any other resource. In my attempts to do this, I actually ran into another bug, so I put this on pause and moved on to another bug, which there's a PR out for right now. This is only in master. There's no released code with this, but we found if Kubernetes minor versions have plus symbols in them, that's not a valid. A plus symbol is not a valid value for labels. It's not a valid DNS name. So there's a PR out for this to strip these invalid characters. So yeah, that's pretty much what I've got now. And then I have some discussion topics.
I have a quick question on that last issue around the labels. And I took a quick look at this and then didn't get a chance to comment, but I'm wondering if if these things are valid annotation values, and if so, whether we should maybe be using annotations rather than labels.
I do not know if they're valid annotations. I can look into that.
Yeah, I can take a look. That's piece of code that I did. It's more than share that. I'll take a look at it.
Sure. Yeah, and I think this was on GKE, so I think they had their own compiled version. Like you can see, they're using 116.8, and I think my PR may need a tweak. I think this is only at the beginning and end. So the error message specifically said that you can't have non-alphanumeric characters at the beginning or end. And in the Kubernetes validation package, there is a valid label. I forget the function name, but it's basically checking is valid label value, not just label name. But there is a function to check if it's a valid label value. So my PR basically adds a Velero version of that and tries to, for internal Velero use, it tries to find the most appropriate value. So that's what I did in my PR. But if an annotation works for our use case here, then we could move it to an annotation. But right now, this is not released code, and it doesn't happen on all platforms. Not all platforms add this plus at the end. So yeah, this just happens with labels that Velero is generating.
Cool. Yeah, let's check out the annotations. My impression is that they're more
More freeform.
Allowing, yeah. And
yeah.
It may just make sense for this information anyway, since we're probably not using it to filter. But we'll check it out, see if that's a possible solution as well, and then we can decide kind of how to move forward.
Yeah. If that fits, if that fits the use cases, then it might just be easier to move those into an annotation and toss this valid label value. I think the label value validation may make sense because right now we are doing some validation on label values, but we're using the label name function. But we can discuss that separately. And yeah, that's what I had.
Any other questions for Nolan? Right, then I think we can dive into your discussion topics here. Cool.
Yeah, so Jonas, if you could open up that link. So this is, so Raphael has this PR for getting all the, basically backing up all versions of, all versions stored for, or known for a given object. And I think the only change I want to see in this PR at this point is that we bump the version of the backup format to be 1.1 because it's backwards compatible, but it's not 1.0 anymore, or 1. And basically, I just wanted to bring this to the attention of the core team. And Carlisia asked the great question, what triggers a bump? Because I don't know that we've ever laid that out, because this is different from the Velero program version. It's the data format. So I wanted to bring this up and resolve it if we could.
This is the file that we write into the tarball, right? There's like a metadata / version file.
Correct. And I think this may, and I would think this is on the backup. I think there's a version on the backup itself. I guess it wouldn't be the CRD version.
Yeah, so I don't think we've ever really put much thought into like how this is used. I think it was, you know, a random idea to put this in there and start with the version of 1 a while back.
This might have been like right when we went to 1.0 and we didn't really discuss it because it was kind of a last minute thing.
Yeah, I honestly think it was further back than that, but I'm not totally sure. I mean, I think it probably makes sense to do a minor version bump. We might want to move to an actual like semver version, but I don't know. But since it's there, I don't think it would hurt to bump it. But we're not using it for anything right now. Yeah,
and I think like the reason I mentioned it here was for documentation, just to be explicit and not use like a recently in the docs, because recently could mean like when I'm reading this a year from now, what does recently mean? If we could point to specifically in backup format v1.1, this is when it changed. So maybe we just say like if we can come up with some rules around when we bump the version, I think that would make sense. To me, this seems like a good time to bump the version, but it's, since in terms of semantic versioning, it's backwards compatible, but it's adding to, it makes sense to be a point release, not a full major format bump.
Yeah, and I think this could be useful in the future if we have a version of Velero that's trying to deal with multiple sort of different historical formats, and it's, at least with the minor version bumps, it's like a nice shorthand way of knowing what information is expected in the tarball, rather than having to unpack the tarball and go like look at the contents and sort of deduce what format version it is. So it could definitely be useful, and it's easy to increment it for now and have that data in all of the backups going forward in case we decide we want to use it down the road. So I think it makes sense. It would be great if someone could maybe take a stab at just like documenting it and documenting when we would increment these things, so that we can at least have some information out there about it.
I can take that.
Cool, thanks.
Actually, why am I writing this in my notebook? I'll put it in the discussion topics.
All right. Any other questions here regarding this? Right. then I think we got Dylan and Scott. We got 2 discussion topics from you.
Yeah, so I can start with the first one. It's around an issue that Scott opened probably about a month ago. I guess it was a long time ago, but we kind of have been circling back to it about a month ago due to some issue we've been hitting in our migration tool. And it has to do with passing additional items back on a restore action. And there's a race condition that if the item that you are passing in as an additional item needs to be restored first, there's no waiting or blocking in Velero. So the actual item that we're trying to restore may fail if some items aren't there. So I know there was some talk on the issue that we tend to agree with about a potential wait function being used on the plugin. This way that you kind of define what logic you want to take in terms of if an additional item is passed in the restore action, how exactly do you know when the item is ready and when you can stop this waiting and blocking function. I don't want to get into like a big design discussion on this call. I was more curious if this was something that other folks are hitting. It's something that we are interested in tackling, but the next issue on the discussion topic is probably a little bit higher priority for us, so I'm not sure when we'll get to it. But I was curious what the Velero team saw as a priority for this, and if you think the next steps here would be producing some design doc around this wait function, or you think that we need more discussion on this issue before we can go and actually implement a design. And Scott, if I missed anything, please add in here.
Steve?
I was just going to say that I think there was, and again, like I said, not really to get into the discussion of it, that there was one kind of design implication that we were going back and forth on trying to figure out kind of it from an implementation point of view in terms of what plugin would be activated for, we'd be calling this on. But again, that would factor into, the design probably as well. Yeah.
But I mean, it sounds like, we might be the only people that this is actually biting, and mainly because, we are working with OpenShift and we have some OpenShift resources that care more about this than others. And we are in the unique case of generally restoring across clusters. So we don't always have the benefit of some existing resources, even if they're cluster scoped or non-cluster scoped, already being ready on restore time. So if we are one of the few people that this is really biting, obviously we can take the lead on starting a design discussion. I was mainly wanting to bring it up in case there are other folks that this was impacting, and maybe they could help out.
Yeah, I can't really think of other folks reporting other instances of this off the top of my head. But I think we're definitely open to the change. So I think, if you guys are willing to sort of take the lead on design, then that's a good path forward.
Okay, great. This next issue that Scott's about to bring up is probably going to take precedence over this. So I don't know when we'll actually get a design up on it, but I'll make a comment on the issue that, we'll circle back and create a design doc first before going and implementing any changes. Scott, you want to take over the next one?
Sure. And then this is an issue that I run into when I'm just going to step back and say, well, one of the things that we're doing with our migrations is trying to allow for PV copies, kind of incremental migration. So we might do a stage migration where we copy the PVs over, but not shut down anything on the source cluster, and then later when we're ready to actually make the change, we do the final migration, which will then make another PV copy. And with Restic, this is pretty much working for us. But I realized with snapshot copy, it's actually not working in this, because when we try to do that second migration, the second restore, the difference between Restic and snapshot is that the actual PV is restored with snapshot rather than it being discarded and reprovisioned. And so since Velero is, seeing, okay, the PV and the PVC exist already, so we're not going to copy them in. You get the warning saying cluster version is different than backup. And I think the result there is that the plugin for the EBS, for example, the AWS plugin is not running, so we're not getting that updated PV. The issue that Dylan linked in there isn't exactly the same. I think in that case it looks like it was a case where someone did a restore with Restic, deleted some files, tried to restore again, and it wasn't updating. But there was a comment saying this is an issue for snapshots as well. So, and again, I don't know if this is an issue that others have run into. I know there's a larger question of how do you handle restores if the resource already exists, and this is kind of a subset of that, I guess. But it's a kind of a different case. I don't know if it's something that makes sense for Velero to make an exception for PVs and figure out a way to make the snapshot restore happen. I'm just not really sure what the right answer is, but I know it's right now it's impacting our incremental restores when we're using snapshots. Is this something that others have run into, something similar?
So I'm just thinking here, so you have restored a PV already, and then so you have the restore over here, you got the original over here, and you're taking another snapshot of the original, and you just want to apply that snapshot on the already restored PV. Is that correct?
Right, right, exactly. And I'm thinking what we'd want to happen would probably be to have, and I don't know if this means we would need to either inside or outside of Velero delete the PV and have it restore again, or if there's a way to just trigger the restore within the PV. I'm just not sure what the way for Velero to do this. I know with Restic it can copy into a volume that's already there, but and snapshots always a different mechanism.
Yeah, we're talking blocks here instead of files.
Right.
So yeah, that's definitely trickier because yeah.
So Scott, is this maybe a specific case of trying to have Velero restore in a resource that already exists?
That's kind of what I'm thinking. At least kind of hits on that. I mean, this is kind of a special case with the larger question of, if you restore, say a pod, for example, that's already there. Right now, the only exception Velero is making, I think, is for service accounts.
Yeah. Yeah, and PVs are special because PVs are one of the special cases because they're immutable.
Right.
And you would have to yeah.
So yeah, I don't even know if is there a way of, triggering the snapshot kind of copy snapshot the volume without deleting the volume first? I mean, maybe the answer has to be that we would need to remove the PV and then restore a new PV, but.
I would say that you're looking something like a hook, like we have pre and post hooks for pods, but you want like a hook, like a warrant event triggering that you can just run Restic restore command.
Well, it's not Restic in this case though. It's actually it's the snapshot or the volume snapshot plugin. Because Restic is actually able to. I mean,
Restic can do it. Yeah, Restic could write over the file system.
I see.
But here they're wanting to do snapshots over the existing.
The snapshot. It's a synchronization conversation.
Yeah, so my previous experience with a ton of backup systems, I don't see this as something that the software that I was working on, not Velero, but I don't think we ever supported that. I think you could do a workaround somehow where you would put a snapshot immediately on the restored PV, and then essentially do a block copy of the original new snapshot over to the snapshot of the restored PV. But yeah, I wouldn't really trust that mechanism.
Sorry, I missed most of the discussion because my internet cut out, but it sounded like, so we have another issue in the backlog around data only restores.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that.
Which sounds like what you're asking for here. The issue number, I had it up a second ago, is 504. So this is the idea of basically just being able to take a snapshot and restore the contents of it into a PV without having to restore the.
And that would be with the PV possibly already existing, or is this or would that mean that the specific, again, the issue that we're hitting is where, you know, if the PV doesn't already exist, it works fine. But if the PV already exists with say a previous snapshot, then it doesn't, because basically, you know, Velero just discards the PV, doesn't restore it, and so then we don't, the plugin doesn't get triggered to run the, you know, copy snapshot to volume.
Yeah, and I don't know that we had, you know, spec'd this out any more than just a very high level description, but the thinking was being able to essentially update the contents of the PV, possibly creating a new PV, but then updating the pods that are using it to refer to the right one. But
okay, that might be something that we covered then.
Yeah, I think this, I mean, we have this in our prioritized backlog. I think this came up, you know, within the last month or two as something that we wanted to try and spend some time looking into designing, but we haven't really made any progress on it.
Okay, yeah, and I guess the thing that I hadn't realized until digging into this was that this is you know, something where it just so happens that this is a use case when you, and this is, I guess, a difference in kind of expected behavior with, you know, because if we're using restic for copy, this works just fine. You know, I can do the migration. I can then modify the source volume, you know, add some new files, do a second migration to the, and it'll do, you know, does the backup and does the restic restore. And in that case, restic will update the existing volume with the new data. But the way the plugins work for snapshots, that doesn't happen because, you know, because the PV already exists, it doesn't restore the, you know, the second version of it, and so we don't get the plugin doing anything.
Yeah, that sounds like that's like a two-pronged thing. Like it's partially, the fix is 1970, which is like making sure we handle, at least for PVs, we handle the existing object correctly. Or I guess it's not necessarily, sorry, 1977. Maybe it's not overwriting the object, but we need to do something more intelligent than just say, oh, it already exists. And then we need to be able to write the contents. But I don't have anything more deep than that at the moment.
The main issue that I see is that the restored PV might have been used before you do the next incremental update, right? So we would have to have the snapshots need to be at the same time on both sides, at the same time frame, because otherwise you might have changes in the restored PV. And you can't overwrite those correctly with the physical block snapshot that you have on the original.
I think the whole point is that the PV is in use. Like there is a PV sitting there that you want to overwrite, right? Is that correct, Scott?
Yeah, well, I mean, in this particular case, you know, just because of the way we're doing the migrations, it doesn't happen to be in use in the sense that, you know, it's kind of it's almost like the stage migration is kind of pre-filling PV data. So the idea being, you know, I might run a stage migration today to copy over all of our, you know, data. And then when we're using restic, at least, we then tomorrow do the actual migration, shut everything down, and restic is checking just, you know, and so it's only copy. So with restic, you know, we actually, I think this is a one of those changes to Rustic that we hadn't made upstream yet, but in our copy we're using, where it's basically when Rustic is copying the file, it actually checks if the file exists already and the two are the same file. It doesn't copy the bits again, so we get kind of benefits of incremental migration of copy there. Now, obviously, with Snapshot, we don't have that, but at the very minimum, the hope would be that if I did that stage migration yesterday and today I'm doing the final migration, including all the running applications, I would want whatever snapshot I took today to get copied into the new namespace. And instead what's happening is I have the old snapshot because the new one's being discarded because the resource exists in the cluster, and so we're not restoring it.
I see. So when so in your migration, you're basically like, you're moving some of the stuff offline essentially, and you have a lot of the data ready in this cluster, and then you're like, okay, we're finally switching over. Let's do the final incremental move.
Right, and for the most part, that's PV data. And again, when we're using Rustic, we're getting the benefit of incremental changes. So our assumption is that volume, since we copied over there, has not been in use. Clearly, if, the volume in use is a different case where you got some volume that you're using, and then you make changes to it. But
right, it's not been the cluster's in use. It's in use in the sense that it's attached to the pod, but the pod's not really doing anything with it. Like there's nothing. Right. There's nothing like there's no users hitting it. There's no transactions. It's mounted.
Right, and in fact, the way we're currently doing it, that pod is even that initial pod, because when we do that initial migration of PV data, we're actually deleting those pods afterwards anyway, just leaving the PVs. So it's actually not even mounted at that point. And then when we do a second migration, essentially repeating the same process as we did the first time, maybe the next day, where again for Rustic, we're just copying those files that have changed. But with snapshots, again, I wouldn't expect the incremental part to happen in the same way. But at the very least, I'd hope to be able to get the new bits over. And just right now, that's not happening because the PV exists, so we discard it. And I'm assuming because of that, the volume snapshot plugin is not, being called in the context of this.
So usually you use when you move data that way, you usually use a replication mechanism, not a backup and restore mechanism. Because backups are supposed to be, here's the data and here's the restore. And file backups, of course, they can be incremental. That's easy. But block backups are essentially, here's the big chunk.
Oh yeah, I get that. I'm not saying, I expect this to work in an incremental way, like you said, but what I would like to see is that, that it would work, that you would get the updated copy at the end. And the answer may be since snapshots are not incremental anyway, the answer here may be not to only do the Rustic copies for the first one, because we're the expectations there's a mixture of Rustic and we're using Snapshot when we can and Rustic depending on where we can't, and the answer may be to just not include the snapshot copies in these incremental ones, because we wouldn't really be getting that incremental benefit anyway. But I also was just wanted to bring it up because I didn't know if this was one of these cases where, if we're doing a restore and we have a snapshot here, and that PV exists already, should there be some way, even if it's an optional flag, to pass to the restore to say, I want to restore the snapshot that's in the backup rather than, leaving what's in the cluster in the case where they both exist.
Yeah, I can speak for the team here. This is just my personal opinion. I would be a little weary having that functionality because I could see a lot of data loss and data corruption happening. If you don't know what you're doing and you're trying to restore things incrementally over another physical block device, things can go very, very wrong. So I would be very careful opening up that optional flag. I'm sure it could be doable, but yeah, the way for incremental migrations like that, restic using file, that works, or replication mechanism, that works too. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, it makes sense too. And I guess the bigger question, that, again, I don't know. I think I guess it was pointed out there were some issues open anyway. It's just in general, you know, this issue of I'm restoring something exists already. You know, if you restore over it, you risk losing data, and if you don't restore it, you risk not getting what you want there, and trying to figure out the right mix there. It's challenging. But okay, yeah, I guess in that context, I'm not sure what the next step would be here, other than to figure, you know, because starting to think again, maybe the answer is to exclude the snapshot back PVs from the incremental ones, because we won't get that the incremental, you know, benefit anyway. But
I think if you want to open up an issue, so we can have a little more discussion about it and see what we could do there.
The issue we linked.
Documented.
Sure. The issue that was linked in the agenda item, I think, is at least partially relevant to that.
Well, you're talking about a physical a block device, though.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I realized that's restic. Though I noticed the comment at the end was talking about being relevant across, you know, snapshots as well. So.
Yeah, so actually we are using the block snapshot, and it is like incremental snapshot, and we are unable to restore in the different namespace if the ones PV is already restored.
Yeah, in a different namespace.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to use incremental snapshots would be awesome. That's not a very helpful comment. I think everybody agrees it would be great.
Yeah.
It just requires more design, because like we do get that question on support. I would say, I don't know, every few weeks, is Velero incremental? And we have to be like, well, what do you mean by that? Because it's not incremental at all for the Kubernetes metadata. It doesn't support incremental snapshots on the cloud providers, and it kind of does on Restic. It doesn't take advantage of the incrementalness of Restic. Any incrementalness it gets out of Restic is kind of accidental. Yeah, I think it requires more thinking if we're going to introduce that on purpose.
Yes, because with Restic, there are chances of data corruption if user restore again.
Yeah, Restic is still very much in the beta phase, and it's, or for our support, it's in the beta phase. And yeah, there's definitely ways you could lose data or corrupt your data.
Yeah, so I think, Scott, if you want to open up a new issue, detailing what you want to do from a snapshot point of view, and skip the Restic portion, and then we can see what we can do there.
Sure, yeah.
Cool. Great discussion. We have just a few more minutes here. We have 3 more discussion topics. So Carlisia, do you want to talk about your liveness check?
Yes, I wanted to bring this up because there is a PR open, and I might be able to use that for my CLI work, like I mentioned earlier. And I think that trying to figure out the best way to ask the questions that are in my mind. I guess the first question is, do we want to have an endpoint like this? Because there are other ways that we can put Velero in a ready state by just using the controller. So, and if we have a liveness check, then my question would be, should we have a different check that checks for readiness? I don't think this is relevant. I just thought I would bring this up. I think one check would be sufficient, just a check that says Velero is ready, in a ready state, meaning it's ready to create a backup. And then, so if we should have this, and we should use this for marking Velero as ready, then I'd say, let's review that PR and get it merged. Or if we decide no, that's not the way to go, then I'll just work with the controller.
So I wanted to clarify some definitions real quick, because if we use this PR, I think we should adhere to the Kubernetes definitions of liveness and readiness, because otherwise it will be confusing. The Kubernetes definition of liveness is that the pod's up and running, and the Kubernetes definition of readiness is that the pod is ready for network traffic. So Kubernetes readiness checks are usually for adding them to a service or a load balancer. So in the Kubernetes context, in if we had like these checks on the pod definition, a readiness check wouldn't be relevant to Velero because we're not behind a load balancer. Okay. We're just like grabbing CRDs or CRs off the API server. Although something you said earlier made me think that we might have to have more discussion on this, because the way this particular endpoint would work is basically it would put the pod, it would cause the pod to be marked unhealthy, and the Velero process wouldn't start all the way. So basically it starts another local web server in a Go routine, and you would hit this endpoint, and that endpoint, when you go to there, it would do some of the checks we do on startup. So it would say, okay, do I have any backup storage locations? No. Well, then that's a 404, or I need to change to some other error. Okay, if I have all those, then do I have any valid ones? So it'll run the is valid check. If none of those are valid, then it will return a 404.
Sorry, go finish, please.
So it's taking all the existing checks that we have that run on server startup, and it's exposing them in this endpoint. And if you just ran this on your laptop outside of Kubernetes, it would just loop. So until someone hits that endpoint or it runs in a Kubernetes server, it would just sit there. The Velero process would just sit there. And this PR would rely on the Velero pod definition having the endpoints defined, and the Kubernetes API server, or actually specifically the kubelet, hitting that HTTP endpoint on some period that we define and saying, are you ready? Or are you live? Sorry, are you live? And if Velero ever said no, then the kubelet would mark the pod as not, or as unhealthy.
I think this could work. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Oh yeah, I think it makes sense to have this, because it means that rather than running some of these checks just at startup, we're running them on an ongoing basis and essentially terminating the container if they don't pass. And then there's also the change to sort of check individual backup storage locations in a controller and have a phase to indicate whether they're valid, meaning reachable, and have the expected set of contents. So it's like, I think I can see these two working together well.
Okay.
If you want a demo, I can do a demo and we can kind of see it. The part that's missing here is I didn't do the pod definition change. That actually puts it in a cluster and calls into it and says, "Hey, poke the endpoint to mark it." The thing I like about this liveness check versus doing it ourselves is it plays into the existing Kubernetes kind of the tool sets. Like this will make it so kubectl can say, "Hey, the Velero pod's not working right," versus just our own custom tools, which kubectl couldn't monitor.
Yeah.
But there's downsides to it, like we are dependent on the kubelet and the kube API server.
I mean, we could also, well, maybe that wouldn't work. I was gonna say we could have our CLI hitting this endpoint, but if the endpoint's not accessible outside the cluster, that's not gonna work.
Yeah, but we could get the, I think it's, we could scrape the deployment. It would be marked on the deployment status.
Right, like the last result of this.
Yeah.
We might also be able to wire it through the server status request to just have that code scraping its own endpoint and reporting the result there. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Nolan, is there more things that you needed to add to the PR? Because I think we should go with that, it sounds like.
The main things are getting the deployment definition updated so that it's actually used in it. I think it might make sense to demo it just so people can see it and see what's getting returned. I know there's other PRs out there asking for like, hey, can you add a web server to Velero? I want webhooks. I want a proxy for the API storage. And if that stuff ever comes, then we could add readiness checks and all that kind of stuff for load balancer. But I think this is one way to solve some of the issues like, hey, we don't check for backup storage locations being valid after server startup. We can have the checks all put into this endpoint and poke it every so often. That's mostly, I think, going to require tuning to find those appropriate time periods, because the one thing that's kind of a gotcha here is we're going across the internet in a lot of cases to reach those backup storage locations. So we can't have this check period be super short. Excuse me. And the other condition it checks for is if the CRDs are defined. So if it starts up and the CRDs aren't added, which is kind of a degenerate case, like oh, sorry, somebody was just outside my door. If it's kind of hard to get in that scenario now. It used to be easier if people didn't apply like the prereqs.yaml, but it can check for that too.
Maybe the CRD is a check that only needs to be done in a startup, because do people usually get rid of them?
I don't know. I don't think it hurt, because in my testing, I was just letting it sit there and loop, and then I applied a CRDs.yaml file, and then it just like recovered. Mm-hmm. So, and then it started serving. So, and like I applied a backup storage location, then deleted it, and then reapplied it, and it recovered. So I don't think it hurts, because then you can like remove the CRDs and re-add them, and Velero just works again. Mm-hmm. So it takes advantage of the self-healing stuff in Kubernetes. I don't want to hard sell this as like, we should do this PR, but like, I think it uses some of the good parts of Kubernetes rather than us trying to reinvent them, even if it's not exactly our use case.
Well, that's why the main reason why I wanted to bring it up was to see if anybody had a negative reaction, like we shouldn't go in this direction. But it sounds like that's one good way to do this. So you want to put a demo on the books for us?
Sure. I can spend some time fixing that up, and I'll get the pod spec written so that it's more complete, so I can actually run it inside of a container.
Yeah, I'll pull your branch and also play with it.
Okay.
Jonas dropped off. I don't think. I mean, should we do the other items because it's past 10 already?
Yeah, I would sort of prefer to push other things to next week and respect everyone's time, unless folks have things that they urgently need to cover.
Yeah.
We can always chat on Slack as well. All right, well, why don't we wrap up? We can cover anything we need to next week, and feel free to ping us on Slack if there's anything you want to talk about sooner than that.
Yeah, and I will get the next week's discussion topic. I'll get the last two discussion topics preceded into next week's discussion.
Yeah, thanks.
Sounds good. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. See you next week.
Bye.